Hi, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Asia Pacific Transport Forum 2024, ADB as a climate change, ADB as a climate bank sessions. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Susan Lim. I'm from the ADB resident mission in Vietnam. I'm the principal portfolio management specialist in charge of the $2.5 billion sovereign project portfolio. I want to give a special thanks to the Transport Sector Group for inviting me to moderate these panel discussions. I joined ADB as a transport specialist in 2008. I took special leave in 2019 to work on transport decarbonization projects with the World Bank in Egypt. When I returned to ADB in January, I found a changed organization, one that has positioned itself as a climate bank with expanded lending capacity in order to meet the most important needs of our times. ADB is the first MDB to commit itself to climate targets. This is what triggered me to want to share my understanding with you today and to learn more alongside with you. Asia and the Pacific region is currently responsible for over 50% of the global greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change. The region is also highly vulnerable to extreme weather and related disaster, with annual losses estimated at $675 billion. This has heavily impact on women, poor and vulnerable populations, people with disabilities, the elderly, and young people. To meet these critical challenges of climate change, ADB is playing a leading role with developing member countries and key partners to deploy targeted new and innovative investment, knowledge, and strategies. And it has set the ambitious goal of providing $100 billion from its own resources of climate actions by 2030. In today's sessions, we want to discuss ADB's role as a climate bank, highlight best practice ADB projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and show how DMCs can avail ADB's financing opportunities. Today's program will have three parts. First, we will ask the panelists to introduce themselves and their roles in ADB as a climate bank. Second, we will start the panel discussions and I will ask the panelists some key questions related to ADB as a climate bank. Third, we will invite you, the audience, via technology or the old-fashioned way to ask your questions to our panelists. So welcome again to today's sessions. Okay, so here we are. Let's start. Let's start from my left, and then I would like to ask our panelists to introduce yourself and your views of ADB as a climate bank. 3 minutes each.
Hello, is this working? Yeah, thanks, Susan. Great to have you back in headquarters. Good morning, everyone, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a great day yesterday, and welcome back to ADB for those visiting. My name is Toru Kubo. I'm the Senior Director covering climate change, disaster risk management, and environment operations in ADB's newly renamed Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. Before assuming my current role, I was with the ADB's energy sector operations for about 10 years. That is under Priyantha, also on the same panel. I was mostly in charge of Southeast Asia operations, including a couple years in Indonesia, just like Susan in Hanoi. But I was in Jakarta for a couple years, and we did the world's first ever energy sector result-based lending on clean energy scale-up and EV charging. And also we launched the flagship energy transition mechanism at the time. Now, this topic, your question, what is our view on ADB as a climate bank, is that right? It's very dear to me because almost exactly 20 years ago, I was hired by ADB as the first full-time climate-focused staff. That was in May 2004. And I was very much alone. I had great colleagues who were involved in climate change-related operations, but not on a full-time capacity. My title was very unique. It was called CDM Specialist. So who knows CDM here in the room? Sharad, of course. Clean Development Mechanism. So my role started explaining what Clean Development Mechanism is. And for those of you familiar, it's about carbon finance. But because I was only staff, I had to cover mitigation to adaptation, the whole spectrum, I deliver capacity building on climate science and all that, and that's not a good idea when you have somebody on carbon finance doing that. Fortunately, we have real experts now. I see Okshu in the room. Of course, we have Kate. We have Sharad, who joined the transport sector many, many years ago. They're real sort of experts in climate. I don't have to do that anymore. But it's been a long journey. Many ups and downs in ADB until about 2 years ago, when we really made a decisive shift to become the region's climate bank. And I'll explain more on this later. But what it means to me is that we're the go-to bank, development bank, for our developing member clients for climate solutions, to address climate challenges, needs, deliver on their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and capture opportunities presented from climate change. Plus, we need to have a secondary impact, because if we're serious about being the climate bank and providing solutions, we cannot just have an influence within our direct sphere of influence, right? So we have to address market barriers, mobilize private investment, and domestic resources to really address the magnitude of adaptation and mitigation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Toru. Kate?
Thanks, Susan, and good morning, everyone. So my name's Kate Hughes. I'm a Principal Climate Change Specialist in Toru's team, where I lead the work on mitigation and just transition. I first started working for ADB in 2010 as a consultant in one of the carbon funds, and then came on as staff about 4.5 years ago. So it has been amazing to look at the evolution of the climate change agenda, I think, in ADB over that time. And it's a really exciting time, I think, for ADB in terms of really committing to the agenda and transforming the institution around it. In terms of, why it's critical, I think we all know unless we solve climate change in Asia and the Pacific, then we won't solve it globally. So our role as a regional institution on this agenda is really critical. I think my perspective is that obviously as an MDB, we have a critical role in scaling up climate finance and really increasing climate finance roles, but that's not our only role in helping to solve, this huge challenge. And I think it's important to remember that dealing with climate change is not only about scaling up climate-specific projects, right? In order to really address climate change, we're talking about fundamental disruption to our economies, to the way we live, to the way we, modes of transport, to how we take transport. And as part of that disruption, all aspects of our lifestyles are going to change. And also in that process, there's going to be winners and losers. And so part of ADB's role is to look cross-sectorally and systematically at what is required to drive that fundamental change and to finance that change, and come up with those multi-sectoral solutions that not only address either adaptation and resilience and mitigation, but address all of the socioeconomic dimensions of that change as well. How we prepare people, how we skill them, how we ensure that we have livable cities, and everything that we need to support that transformation around climate change. So I think for ADB, the adoption of the agenda institution-wide really facilitates that systemic approach, and it requires collaboration across all departments and parts of ADB. So I think we've started that journey. There's a lot of work to do, but it's a really exciting time to be involved in it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. And it's good to see energy sector sitting here in the transport forum. I probably, for the first time, I'm sitting here. Anyway, also it's good to see my colleague from the energy sector taking over climate change and sustainable development work, because as all of us could obviously aware, energy is a critical input to all the sectors. In fact, if you look at climate challenge in any of the sectors, you have to look at the energy sector is central to it, and you need to address energy sector issues. I joined as an energy specialist in the South Asia department some time ago, not as long as Toru, of course. And then I took over South Asia Energy Division as the director and then chief of energy sector group, and then moved to the current position. Before that, of course, I was mostly in the policy and regulatory, and of course, most part of my life I used to be in academia, actually, supporting the governments in various forms. So in here, as far as the question, whether we see ADB as the climate bank. In fact, that decision came, as Toru said, about 3 years ago. In fact, even by that time, energy sector has been working on addressing climate challenge. As Toru quite rightly said, many years ago we had the 2009 energy policy. Interestingly, mostly focusing on addressing climate issues like renewable energy, energy efficiency, and governance issues related to energy sector, basically focusing on development of clean energy sources. So, and we were preparing for it, and eventually, 3 years ago, we declared ourselves as a climate bank. And in fact, that's a very good initiative. The reason being that somebody will have to take lead in Asia Pacific region, and ADB being the leader particularly in the energy sector in this region, we have a big role to play. And of course, at the same time, we need to look at the energy sector, not just on the sustainability side, but also energy access and energy security side from that viewpoint, because still we have a lot of people without access to electricity, without access to clean cooking, and so on. So, but ADB as a climate bank has a major role to play. As far as the energy sector is concerned, I consider, of course, mainly our interventions are in 3 different areas. One, of course, as Toru said, we can support the government. We have been supporting governments in bringing in the right policies and the regulations to move the energy sector towards a more cleaner, low carbon development path to support the energy transition. That's one part we have been supporting in both through technical assistance and also through policy-based lending. Then, of course, it's important to bring in innovative and technologies, business models, and so on to accelerate this process. In that space, we have been supporting the governments. And the last but not least is the most important part is investments. We have been providing investments in clean energy space. And if you look at the energy sector investments, it's basically all focused on addressing climate challenge while we, in parallel, focusing on energy access and other issues. So with that, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning to everybody. I'm a bit a strange creature here on the panel as I'm not an ADB employee. Probably it's because I'm a fossil. I work since '91 on climate change and transport, and had my first assignments were with ADB in this area in the '90s with the task to look at what CO2 impact could have some transport investments and which one could have positive impact. That later resulted in the CDM part to look how that could be monetized with carbon credits. At that time, it was also basically you looked at clean air and then you added on CO2. Now it's reversed. You have a climate and then you add on the clean air. So there have been massive changes, and I think it's a great opportunity and big steps that ADB is taking in this part. Transport will move anyway to low carbon, even under a baseline. I think the issue is basically how can you speed up and deepen the process. That's the role of a bank like ADB. And that's where I see that you have major opportunities. There are many technologies or options already available today. Often these require more capital investments than the traditional approach. So there is a major role for a bank for new business models as well as for finance to enable the adoption of these measures. And ADB can take such a role, be it in mitigation, greening up all of its types of investments, trying to invest in traditional transport as well as in new transport, but if it's in traditional transport, to make it more climate resilient, to make it more with a larger impact and always trying to be at the borderline and not just make business as usual investments or somehow novel investments, but really stretch a bit the border to make it faster and deeper the transition. So I think there are great opportunities in this area, and ADB is doing many steps, be it from the private sector facility or be it from the public part to greener its investments.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pinnapa Satitpatanapan. I am part of ADB's private sector infrastructure finance team. So I cover infrastructure investments, including energy, transport, telecommunication in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. ADB as the climate bank, climate change and private sector are two of the four key focuses under the ADB's new operating model. As a development bank, we are keen to support new and innovative technology such as EV in the transport sector. Our mandate is to work with other multilateral development banks and commercial lenders to mobilize private capital to support sustainable transport, as well as to enhance environmental, social standards of our clients. We work with our sovereign and regional departments and the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department to deliver solutions to our clients and to address their funding needs. Later in the presentation, I will be sharing with you on some case studies to demonstrate how ADB work with the private sector to support the transition towards net zero. Thank you.
Thank you. So I hope you share the view with me that we have quite a diverse panel this morning, and then from different areas of the ADB, and share with us what does it mean to us, our role as ADB as a climate bank, right? So I'm going to start with my first questions to Toru. And this is a big picture questions that I often have in mind. And ADB is Asia Pacific Climate Bank. So what is the strategic rationale behind this initiative? What does it mean for ADB to be a climate bank?
Right, thanks, Susan. The first part, it was really led by management of the bank and the board, the shareholders. So I will try to explain what that means. But I think just to relate to all of us, Kate already mentioned that Asia Pacific is very vital in this battle against climate change. We already represent more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions. We have the most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts. So if we don't address climate change together with development, all our development gains will not be sustainable. They'll be short term. We'll be more susceptible to disasters coming in the future. And of course, the most vulnerable of our communities will be most at risk. So it's with all our shareholders of ADB that we decided on a vision, which is the Asia Pacific region that is prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So unless we really mainstream and look at climate change solutions in all part of our development operations, we're not going to achieve that vision. Many of our countries, and I'm sure delegates this week, are from countries and areas that are really facing a survival situation. You know, low-lying areas, you know, countries and also coastal cities, mountainous, landlocked countries. What happens when the glaciers disappear? And I don't think the climate science has been communicated very well. You know, we hear about 2 degrees warming, right? Let's say. Well, what does that mean? Many people think, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, actually, 2 degrees average warming for the planet means about 4 degrees average on land, where most people live. And in the higher latitudes, it's even 6 degrees and 8 degrees. Many of you know that 1 degree warming leads to 7% roughly increase in moisture in the atmosphere. 4 degrees average is 28% more moisture in the atmosphere. What happens when that hits a cold mass? It all drops on land. So, you know, it really impacts all parts of the community. We say glaciers to the rivers, to the ocean, and the heat stress on farmers, on people working outside, the labor force. What is the impact on that, right? So just a couple weeks, was it last week, Kate? In Thailand, the heat index hit 52 degrees. In Manila, 48 degrees. It's just unthinkable. So I think we are now starting to really feel that, internalize that, and say that we have to mainstream. And this is a big shift. And so Pin already talked about the 4 shifts of ADB's first major structural change, reorg, in 20 years. And so we have climate change shift and private sector development shift, solution shift and new ways of working. The last 2 are more means to an end, right? It's really climate change. And if we are to really tackle this problem, the needs on adaptation mitigation, we have to unlock private capital, right? Redirect private investment. And so the 2 go together, the climate and private sector development shifts. You know, so I mentioned that it's been a long and winding road, and Priyantha talked about the evolution of the energy sector operations. We've been adding sort of climate expertise here and there, but it's totally different. It's about becoming, some of us say bilingual or multilingual. Like many of us are, let's say you are transport experts. I worked on transport with Susan and others and Sharad for many years. With transport sector expertise, where are the opportunities to enhance resilience? Where are the opportunities to gradually decarbonize? And by the way, improve air quality, reduce noise emissions, improve safety, right? So where are those integrated opportunities that we can really, really pursue? So every transport specialist in ADB, we are really working on a program so they can enhance their capacity and understand opportunities. We can respond to the developing country member needs. So we used to talk about climate finance in the climate team. Now we have a finance sector group. Climate finance should be led by the climate, by the finance sector group. Market development PPP team office, they're now leading on carbon market development, right? So every part, procurement leading green procurement. So that's really what this means, and we've really embarked on this journey in a serious manner over the past 2 years. Just one last thing is we have a climate change action plan that was adopted last year. Kate will explain more, I think, but we're collecting ideas. Many of the actions are there to make it more attractive so our clients can really feel that we are responding to your climate and development needs. So please let us know if you have ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Toru, for helping us to visualize what it means, climate change to us, right? It's really impacting our daily life. Just like what you said, a couple of weeks ago in Hanoi, we reached 42 degrees, and then all of a sudden, and then the next day it dropped to 30. And then this is really extreme change in temperature, right? And then people say because of deforestation. So I think, climate change is really affecting all of us. And then it's good to hear that ADB has these big visions in how to address it from the corporate level. And I think the next question is really for Kate. So ADB is targeting $100 billion in cumulative climate financing from its own resources to its developing member countries in 2019 to 2030. So how can ADB operationalize this ambitious target?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess the core of this question is what do we do practically, right, to achieve these aims? So I think first off, just to say that in 2023, ADB was able to commit its highest ever level of climate finance, so at 9.8 billion, which significantly scaled up from the year before at 6.7 billion. And this included 1 billion for non-sovereign, as well as a lot of, for example, in the transport sector, it was 2.5 billion. So change has happened and we're proud of where we're at, but there's a lot more to do. So I think how are we going to achieve it? So as Toru mentioned, at COP28 in Dubai last year, we launched a climate change action plan. And that really sets out the pathway of how we intend to achieve the climate commitments that we've made. This is a living document. It needs to evolve as we evolve, but it's a good focal point to look at practically how we implement it. So I think, first of all, it's about strengthening our value proposition. So beyond finance, ADB as a regional institution needs to look at strategic and programmatic solutions, right? As I mentioned before, how do we look at multi-sectoral collaborative problem solving rather than just project financing? So I think that mindset is the first critical point. The second is that we need to look at long-term engagements with our countries and partnerships on climate change that are not about individual projects. They're about full cycle support and joint problem solving. So one of the core parts of the Climate Change Action Plan is the concept of upstream, midstream and downstream support. So upstream, working with our governments and our clients on looking at policy and institutional environments, what's needed to really address climate change and to, embed climate change in development. And that includes technical assistance support, capacity building, advocacy, engaging in global agendas. And then at the midstream, working with governments on how do we help to embed climate change in systems. So in fiscal planning, in budgeting processes, all the systems needed to support. And then downstream on the critical financing, and what sort of projects. But if we look to engage long-term and systematically across that entire spectrum, then we will help to shift the pipeline so that when we get to the downstream and we have project and program investments, they're already well climate informed and part of that kind of strategic climate agenda for the country. One of the other things ADB is looking at is how to strategically use policy-based loans and results-based loans as different lending instruments to support climate change. And those policy-based loans are particularly critical when we look at that upstream and midstream support and how ADB can deploy finance, but in a way that helps to strengthen that policy and institutional environment in the countries to support climate change. We're also looking, at how we can make our balance sheet work harder and free up more headroom to deploy climate financing in our DMC. So in September last year, ADB approved its capital adequacy reforms, and that really looks at, the optimal balance and how we can free up more headroom that can be lending around our new operating model and our new mission as a climate bank. And I think then there's a lot of strategic initiatives, and there's too many to go through in another few. There's really exciting work. Priyantha mentioned the energy transition mechanism. There's lots of sectoral climate initiatives. But maybe one to mention is IFCAP, which is the Innovative Financing Facility for Asia and Pacific. And this is the first leveraged guarantee mechanism for climate finance ever to be adopted by a multilateral development bank. And so this will allow ADB to significantly increase the amount of finance it has available. So I think it's that combination of how we strategically engage long-term cross-sectoral problem solving with our countries, and then coming through with innovative financing mechanisms and innovative approaches to be able to actually deploy the support to support those relationships. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. One interesting topic that you mentioned just now and is transitions to our next questions, actually. This is for Priyantha. Asia and the Pacific account for more than 50% of global CO2 emissions, where more than half come from electricity and heat. How does ADB facilitate the transition to sustainable, low carbon and resilient energy systems? So can you explain more about the Energy Transitions Mechanism, ETM.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Susan. Before I really get on to energy transition mechanism per se, probably Toru may be able to explain it better than I do because he is the one who really led the whole initiative with his team. But before coming to that, as Susan quite rightly said, we have a major responsibility in this region because we are responsible for 50% of the GHG emissions at the moment. Maybe this contribution will even grow with the exponential economic growth experience in this region. And half of that comes from coal power plants in this region. So we have to do something about it. Everybody started talking about have been talking about the future, clean energy development, energy efficiency improvements, and so on and so forth. But very little was discussed on the about the existing power, generation stock which emits GHGs. So energy transition mechanism is basically to address that part of it, which is a very important part. You have to do something about the current coal power plants, current fossil fuel-based power plants. So energy transition mechanism came as a result of that actually, which ADB initiated, announced a few years ago. Before coming to the details of it, as far as the energy sector is concerned, our contribution to ADB as a climate bank is very important. Obviously, as I said, energy is an input to almost all the sectors, and in fact, the basis or the main culprit of GHG emissions in any of these sectors is eventually goes down to energy, boils down to energy. So energy sector side, we have been, as I said, supporting in three different key areas. One, of course, when it comes to upstream work, policy making, the regulations, capacity development to make sure that the energy community is capable of handling, climate challenge. The second is, of course, we cannot address climate challenge just by looking at traditional technologies, traditional systems, traditional approaches to energy sector development. We need to make sure that the latest and the most innovative technologies which come in as low carbon technologies are brought in and introduced to these countries. From that viewpoint, we need to demonstrate, because obviously the countries wouldn't accept things just like that. And as an honest broker between the DMCs and the financiers and the technology providers, we have a responsibility to demonstrate these technologies to improve confidence among our clients. So we have been doing that as demonstration project. One example is, in fact, just last week, a couple of weeks ago, I inaugurated the Agri photovoltaic system in Sri Lanka, basically using the solar panels put up on top of tea plantations. And as you know, Sri Lanka has enormous land area covered with tea plantations, and it's a land scarce country. So if you can use agri photovoltaics, then we can improve solar PV investments in Sri Lanka. So that's demonstrated. If it works, we can replicate it. No. So the second area where we are involved in is basically the third is investments. We bring in investments. Energy sector investment has been about 20% of overall investments from ADB for many, many years. But of course, it has gone down recently because of the COVID and other barriers. But we are picking up, and then we try to bring this back to pre-pandemic times and even more as we go along. So these are the three areas where we have been involved in. Going down to ETM itself, ETM is basically, in short, what it does is that we invest in the existing fossil fuel-based facilities to replace the current investments with low-cost investments, so that the investor can earn the returns within a shorter period of time as compared to what was envisaged before. Which means you can get the returns during a shorter period of time, and therefore you can close down the power plants shorter or during a shorter period of time as a result, because you have already earned your returns. And So that's what is called ETM, energy transition mechanism. But of course, you can expand this into many sectors, many other areas. But as far as we are concerned, we are trying to demonstrate this in Indonesia, our first power plant. We are trying to shorten the lifetime of that power plant, or we try to close it down maybe 10 years before, than the originally expected time period, because we bring in low-cost financing to replace the current financing in the power plant. So, in short, that's what is meant by energy transition mechanism, and that the energy gap will be replaced with clean energy solutions, which we can bring in as separate investments. So, this is clean energy the energy transition mechanism. With that, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyantha. So after the energy sector, transport is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, especially in urban areas. So how can the transport sector contribute to ADB's climate initiative? So this question is for Jurg. From your experience in working in the transport sector across countries, what do you think are the successful policies that foster transport decarbonization?
Thanks, Susan. At the core point, I would put electric mobility for all. Electric mobility is really the transforming agent which can make a massive change and get to low or zero carbon emissions. Of course, there are all other fields like public urban transport, non-motorized transport, there are rail transport, mode shift to low carbon transport means, but at the center point and transformational process, I would see electric mobility. Often the question pops up, well, don't we have to have a green grid first and then we can move to e-mobility? Even if you take the grid factor of Mongolia or of PR China or of India, which have among the highest grid factors in the world, even there, with e-mobility, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis by 20 to 40%. So you don't need to wait till your energy sector is green. Of course, the impact will be larger if it is green, but you can already start now with the transport sector with e-mobility. Now, if we look at the policies, you have the classic policies which have been discussed since decades, don't subsidize fossil fuels. In practice, countries don't implement them, and often don't implement them also because then they will be toppled, the government, by the public, because they don't agree on having higher fuel prices. It's the same for urban transport. We're using the same example of London for demand management since 3 decades, because it's the only example, or one of the only examples. So although these policies are theoretically nice and have a great impact, in practice, they are extremely difficult to put up. So that's why also banks like the ADB go much more for the supply. They support public transport projects which can be made greener. They support rail projects, and they work less on trying to restrict the demand, for example, from private passenger cars, because that's really a difficult part. And that's where electric mobility can come in with important components. What can be done there is originally from, if you look at electric mobility, you had to have high incentives from the financial part to foster e-mobility. Now, the interesting part is that this isn't required anymore. You don't need these high subsidies anymore, at least for vehicles, at least for passenger cars or buses or light-duty vehicles. Prices have gone down considerably. They're cost competitive today, at least on a life cycle basis. You might need other finance models for them, but you don't need direct subsidies anymore. Where you still need policies and where they are successful are, for example, in charging infrastructure, where also ADB can come in through private sector investments like you've been doing, or also when you're building roads to include charging infrastructure from the start. Think of charging infrastructure for trucks, for example, where you need high-powered megawatt chargers. So you need to think from the start when you build such roads, how are they connected to the grid? Where could these points be? Otherwise, you won't be able to then move your long-haul trucks to electric mobility thereafter if you don't have the power stations. That's also where you need incentives. If you have incentives for charging infrastructure, you reduce one of the barriers for adoption of electric mobility, and that can be a very cost-effective investment in that sense. You can see how quickly things evolve also in that part. For example, in the case of Thailand, 2 years ago, the share of electric passenger cars sold in Thailand was less than 0.5%. Early this year, January, February, it was more than 20%. So you can have massive changes in short time. Why? Putting up charging infrastructure, providing incentives for cars, changing regulations for cars to make them attractive. And that's where also private sector impact comes in from ADB, which supported, for example, various private sector ventures in Thailand in electric mobility. So I think there are great opportunities what to do and to speed up the process.
Thank you. So this is a good transition into the private sector, right? We hear about cost and funding quite often from the last few panelists. So here's my questions to Pin. To achieve a global transition towards net zero, clean energy or transport investment need to triple and even increase sevenfold in emerging and developing economies. What is the private sector role to help boost finance to the required scale? And how can ADB prioritize climate in private sector operations and examples? Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And in this presentation, I will be focusing on our sustainable transport effort in the Southeast Asia region. So we made our first footprint in Southeast Asia back in 2018. And so far, we have mobilized more than 680 million of private capital to support 7 sustainable transport projects in Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Out of this amount, 70% is from ADB's ordinary capital resources, 25% from parallel loans from our co-lenders, and the remaining 5% is from concessional financing and grants. As I mentioned, that our mandate is not only to support a sustainable transport project, but also to work with other financiers so that they can take more risks and able to support new and innovative technologies. We also have available technical assistance to support early stage feasibility and market studies, as well as technical due diligence. The overall impact is that we have support more than 1,300 e-buses, 1,500 e-tuk-tuks, 27 e-ferries, more than 1,000 EV charging stations, and 2 MRT lines, which contributes to over 70,000 tons of CO2 emissions avoidance. I'll go through some of the case studies to see how we can work with our private sector clients. As I mentioned, the first project in this area is that we work with BTS Group and its consortium to support the construction and operations of 2 monorail lines in Bangkok, Thailand. ADB provided a 320 million loan to fund the project. For ADB, we can provide US dollar loans as well as local currency loans. We also provide fixed interest rate to the client to help mitigate interest rate fluctuation risks. In this case, the loan is in Thai baht in order to match with the revenue of the project company. This transaction supports the use of clean public transport and reduce usage of private transport, which mainly uses fossil fuel. We also reduce the government's fiscal burden through the public-private partnership arrangement. In this project in particular, ADB's additionality is that since the project received the government subsidy during the initial operation period, we provided a longer tenor loan with back-end repayments in order to mitigate the ridership risk and also to match with the cash flows of the company. The second one is the financing of the EV charging network and the first green loan for e-mobility in Thailand. We work with Energy Absolute on the green loan principles to help them get certification by the Climate Bonds Initiative to make sure that they adhere to international standards and best practices. This project we worked on during COVID-19 when the capital markets were pretty much shut down, but we see the importance of maintaining clean, sustainable transport activities during the crisis. You see that for this project, we actually bundle the our support on the e-mobility, and then we bundle it together with 2 other solar and wind projects in Thailand. Next one, we work with Energy Absolute again to support the fleet of e-ferries along the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok, Thailand. I can tell you that the boats are very packed during rush hour, and I myself took these boats before I moved to the Philippines. So for this project, we took a lead in transaction structuring in order to mitigate key risks, such as the ridership and technology risk, and work with other co-lenders, JICA and the Export-Import Banks of Thailand, so that they get comfortable with this new sector and able to come along with us to support the project. Next one, anyone in this room has a VinFast car? Any other EV cars? Tesla, BYD? Great. So in 2022, we mobilized a 135 million financing package for VinFast to support their manufacturing of e-bus fleets and EV charging station networks in Vietnam. At ADB, we manage various donor trust funds, which we can tap into when we support new sectors like EV. So for usually when we work on a private sector projects, what we are looking for are 3 main components. First, the project has to be financially viable. Second, the sponsor has to be experienced and capable. And third, it has to generate development impact. In this case, since it's a new and nascent sector, we are able to utilize concessional financing from the Australian Climate Finance Partnership, funded by the Australian government, the Clean Technology Fund, and a grant from the Climate Innovation and Development Fund, which is funded by Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Moving up through the EV supply chain, in the Philippines, we work with Wintron on their, to expand their EV charger production facilities in the Philippines. For this particular project, I would like to mention the Gender Action Plan, which basically one of ADB's agenda is to promote gender equality. What we do is that we usually look at the country and sector context as well as the baseline numbers of a company, and then we work with them to see how we can further the gender equality agenda in the organizations. Some of the initiatives are the company will develop a gender and diversity procurement policy. They'll increase female participation in technical and management training. They'll develop in-house capacity to train staff in an anti-sexual harassment and gender equality. You see that for all of the projects that we support, they'll have some sort of gender components, more or less, but definitely gender is one of our top priorities. Next one, we work with Energy Absolute to finance one of the first large-scale financing of e-buses for public transport. For this project, we work with our sovereign department to provide technical assistance to support the public bus market due diligence, which was shared with other co-lenders. Last but not least, we financed a fleet of e-tuk-tuk to Banpu, a company in Bangkok. In this case, not only that we support the e-tuk-tuk fleets, but also the charging station in Thailand, as well as their battery manufacturing facilities in the People's Republic of China. We also tap into our technical assistance to fund a market study on micro level urban mobility landscape in various Southeast Asian countries. Hope you understand and how we work with the private sector to help increase the efforts in clean energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Pin. I was a bit hesitant when you asked who has a VinFast. I want to raise my hand, but I take VinFast taxi to and from the office. So I wasn't sure, can I raise my hand and then, but it's definitely a very efficient and very, also, from the consumer point of view, it's very comfortable and it's quiet, it's clean, it's nice. So I'm very happy to hear your presentation. So my next question is to Priyantha and Jurg. So what are some best practices and projects you see in your area, such as energy and transport, to support ADB's goals at Climate Bank? So we hear the private sector part. I think it would be good to hear the solvent side, right? So please, 10 minutes together, so 5 minutes each.
Yeah. Yeah, you have already seen the projects coming from private sector. In fact, when it comes to transport and energy addressing climate challenge, it's likely to be mostly private sector driven, because obviously it's, when it comes to sovereign, when it comes to public sector investments, it will have to be more upstream, bringing in policies, as I said, demonstration of technologies, and putting in institutional structures and so on and so forth. Let me give you one example from, of course, a smaller country like Maldives. Now, we are trying to demonstrate an electric ferry in Maldives. Why? Because while addressing climate challenge, we have to address a major issue in the Maldives. Because in Maldives, its entire energy system is dependent on imported petroleum oils, liquid petroleum. In fact, that was the very reason why we originally came into Maldives in the energy sector, which is a huge, energy sector project to replace the diesel power generation with solar, and then bring in batteries to make it hybrid along with solar PV systems. And simply because Maldives spend even today about 10% of its GDP to import petroleum, and 40% of it goes to the transport sector, which means we need to really do something in the transport sector. So we are trying to bring in this electric ferry, because ferry transport is the most important transport mode of transport in the Maldives, naturally with so many islands, 187 or so islands, inhabited islands, which needs transport system. So we spend under one of our energy projects, invest in this electric ferry, and in fact the charging is based on solar PV systems, and hopefully this will be in place by next month. Now that's one of the things what we did from public investments. But once that's done, obviously private sector will have to take it up and expand it, unless it's public transport systems, where we may have to bring in our own sovereign investments. Another example is in PRC, under Greater Beijing Tianjin Highway project. It's a larger project, basically to bring down the emissions in that region. Part of that, one component of that was bringing in electric charging stations. One of the first initiatives in the country to bring electric charging stations for electric buses, and to provide the necessary accessories and other support needing to make sure that these charging stations are very well utilized and user experience is enhanced, and so on and so forth. That's another one. And the latest now, we are planning to going to Pacific in Fiji when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel. And we are trying to look at how we can bring in, biofuels to blend with current aviation fuels, so that the air transport can be supported through some of the interventions from Fiji, because the sugarcane, the bio fuels can be produced in places like Fiji. And also, when it comes to Palau, we have been intervening in the Palau energy sector, to replace current fossil fuel-based systems with solar PV. And now we have ended up with more solar PV than what can be accommodated in the current, power supplies, power system. And what do we do with this extra renewable energy? The best thing is to, store it and use it for other purposes. So we are looking at bringing in public transport, electric transport systems to support the power system, to store energy, use it for transport, and when needed, to push it back to the grid to stabilize the grid. And that's another solution which we are looking at. So these are some of the examples which I can bring. I can go on, and we have a long list of things which we have been doing, which we will be doing. We are looking at not only as demonstration projects, but later on as replication, mostly through private sector investments, and enabling private sector investment environment will be provided through sovereign financing. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to highlight 2 examples. One also following on the former discussion for Tajikistan, where classical road investment should be made by ADB. Now, how does this evolve towards a more Paris, in agreement with the Paris Agreement project? One is to make the climate resilience of the road, but the other is to use materials which are of lower impact in terms of construction as well as maintenance. But the more interesting component is that the road already includes from the start to establish every 60 kilometers a charge hub for passenger cars. Although there are very few passenger cars electric in Tajikistan, it will also pick up there. Electricity prices are very low. It's basically over 95% produced by hydropower, and you have to import fossil fuels. So it's for the country, it's also from the perspective of finance, it's an important component to shift towards electric mobility. And also thinking of charge hubs for trucks in the future, looking at the grid, where does the road go, where could parking spaces be, and to involve and include that already in road construction. Another interesting part there is that you don't just look at the specific project that is being linked up to a policy part where you look at EV policies and a charging infrastructure policy, which could then be applied not only for one road sector, but on a national level. So you use a road investment to make a fundamental change and to foster policies which then have a larger impact. A second example I'd like to give is recently the Green Climate Fund approved a program of the Asian Development Bank on e-mobility for 7 member countries of the ADB. And the interesting part of this e-mobility program, which is focused on electric buses, is that it doesn't just finance electric buses. The program includes components to improve the resilience of the urban transport sector, for example, by having more green roads, by having better drainage systems, by reducing potential of flooding or of heat waves, etc. So it has not only mitigation, but also the resilience part. And it doesn't just include vehicles, it also has improvements to the public transport system, includes non-motorized transport, includes improved ticketing or other areas which make public transport more attractive and more convenient for users. So it doesn't just look at green vehicles, but it tries to have an integrated approach towards low carbon public transport and making it more attractive in the cities. So what I think is interesting in such an example is that you combine, it's basically public finance, because in the cities involved, the public transport systems are to a large extent operated by public operators. So it looks at how to finance these systems with concessional finance, but also shift towards a more attractive public transport system, which is also more resilient towards climate shocks and towards new ventures which are coming up. So it's an integrated approach and not just a piecemeal approach, which I think is interesting. And compared to the other example where if you go to road authorities, I remember going some years ago to Thai road authorities, they were saying, what I have nothing to do with the cars riding on my roads or with e-mobility. I said, yes, well, you built the roads, thereafter you get the traffic. So you might not be directly responsible, but indirectly you're responsible. So you have to also take care of fostering policies and of moving the types of vehicles which move on your roads to have a lower impact. So trying to look at things in a more integrated manner, I think, is also an important part of moving ADB towards being a climate bank.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up a little bit and move to the third part of our today's sessions. So this is the part where you come in, and I've received some questions on the event air, and then perhaps we can do 3 questions online, and then maybe 3 questions on the floor. You're welcome to come onto the microphone, but we will start from the events air questions first. So I see we have received many questions, but I see there are a few that is quite interesting, and also there's a theme of it. So the first one I see is how does ADB implement and monitor climate actions in its initiatives? So I think that question probably is to Kate. And then another question I see is how does ADB collaborate with other organizations on climate initiatives? Perhaps that questions will be to Toru. And then the third questions I see is about electric mobility, and is to Jurg. So do you think to have electric mobility, the supply chain and life cycle is sustainable? Will it not be negative circular economy? So there's a third questions. Okay, let's start with Kate, Toru, and then Jurg come in. Yes.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think the focus of the question is on how we determine impact, right? So I did talk in the previous answer about climate finance, and we have a very well-established methodology and system for tracking climate finance, but ultimately that's an input. And as we confront the challenge of climate change, we really need to be understanding what impact we have with those dollars that are deployed. So the multilateral development banks are jointly working on this. We did announce at COP last year some joint work on harmonized output indicators or outcome indicators. So what type of indicators can we use to monitor and determine the impact? So we are looking at sets of indicators in mitigation, adaptation, and also in just transition in terms of managing those socioeconomic dimensions. And we're hoping by the end of this year to have a proposal on set of outcome indicators. So they're very climate specific, but we also need to look at how they integrate into ADB systems. So we already have a corporate results framework. So how do we integrate those new outcome indicators into the corporate results framework that we have? We also announced that all of our projects will be Paris aligned, well, 100% of sovereign by July last year and 100% of non-sovereign by July 2025. And so we have an assessment methodology for assessing the Paris alignment of projects. And I think what's really important about that methodology is that projects need to be aligned both on the mitigation and the adaptation or resilience side. So even if it's a primarily mitigation investment, it also needs to take account of adaptation and resilience. And then I think lastly, as I mentioned, looking at all of the business processes and systems of the bank. So not just the climate-specific ones, but looking at procurement, looking at our supply chains, looking at all the businesses' processes of how we operate as a bank and how we start to think about climate impact through all of those. Thanks.
Toru? Oh, you
I
want-
know I'm disruptive like always, Suzanne. I just wanted to add something on monitoring. I think if you look at that, at actual monitoring of transport projects, that's still a space where one could do much more, and there are technologies today to do more. It's still very traditional, doing surveys and collecting secondary data, etc. Then you get the result of the CO2 impact based on that, which has default values 10 years ago or 2 years ago, you measured something. There are today technologies where you can measure directly with satellites and on-ground sensors real-time CO2, and not what results in CO2, but you measure CO2 and changes in CO2, and can track that back to the transport sector. Cities are not using that instrument in a corresponding manner today. They could. They make targets, we want to reduce 20% CO2, but they don't even know how much they emit today. And they have no tracking method. So I think this would be an area where you can make much more in actual monitoring and giving the instruments also to countries as well as cities, which are a major driver in the transport sector of reducing CO2, to monitor the impacts of their policies and their adjustments based on receiving the data today, Wednesday, of what were your emissions yesterday, Tuesday, and you can have that, and that exists today. Often participants don't really want to know what their emissions levels are because they're afraid that thereafter their policies don't have that impact which they grandly state, and that they're not reaching their targets. But it is important that you make actual monitoring.
It's good to know that technology keep improving, and then we can utilize it to how to monitor the impacts and to see how our work put into and how it's affect the on the ground situations, right? That's very good to know. So we go back to Toru and how do we work with other partners, right? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to disrupt also, but I love what Jurg said. It's also very much linked to potential carbon finance coming in. I had flashbacks of working with Sharad in the room on a program of activities for urban transport, CDM methodology, but this is going to be very much relevant for Article 6, both Article 6.2 on government and also Article 6.4 on more private sector-led of activities. So a very important point, and with digital technology, it's becoming cheaper, more efficient to do so. So on partners, right? That's the question. So first of all, we work with many partners. The whole point is crowding in, and it's an ecosystem of support. Our developing member country clients, they work with many development partners, and we're one of them. Kate already mentioned about the intense work amongst the multilateral development banks. It's really MDBs as a system. Many of our colleagues, so Kate on mitigation, we have Argo on adaptation, and many colleagues, they spend weekly sort of evenings, 1 or 2 evenings. Unfortunately, we are on the east side of the time zones, and with Europe and US, it's always late night in Asia, but to coordinate, harmonize, and come up with common principles, methodologies, so that we're not burdening our developing member country clients with very different ways of doing things. But more broadly with international financial institutions, right? So we work very close, depending on the country, like for example, where I was in Indonesia, it's KfW, Alliance France, and JICA, who are the main partners, and the Australian DFAT. So we always collaborate there. There's a regular development partners forum. Now, many of you probably heard about country platforms. So in Bangladesh, there's a climate and development country platform. It's a country owned and driven, and it's to crowd in different partners to cover different various climate needs so that we don't duplicate, we have synergy, we coordinate. So one of the examples, the first examples of the country platform is the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia that Priyantha and Kate has been really heavily involved in. It's much easier said than done. There's a lot of coordination, but there's also value addition to make sure that we are contributing our unique strengths to different aspects of that whole of a society transition. We work with private sector, of course. Pin gave a great example there, but also on knowledge partnership with certain companies that have that expertise. So we've been discussing with insurance industry and reinsurance industry for many years on how do we reduce risks and keep insurance products affordable because of the risk band is really widening and the premiums are becoming unaffordable. We work with CSOs. So one example on nature-based solutions, we work with BirdLife International on the regional flyways. We work with the Nature Conservancy on core insurance. This is a fantastic, fascinating area where healthy coastal ecosystems can reduce the strength and height of storm surges. And it protects the coastal cities, right? Your properties, and of course your transport system and energy and other critical infrastructure. So we're working with TNC on that. So those are just examples, but the question was how. So I already mentioned country partnerships. I already mentioned knowledge partnerships. And of course, as a public institution, especially through our sovereign public operations, we have to tender out, right? So when we have a good idea, then we tender out, we see the proposals, and we go with the strongest partner. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move to Jurg for the questions about the e-mobility.
Electric cars are not zero emission or won't be completely clean. I think that's clear. Everything you produce somehow and you somehow will have its environmental impact. The core question on the one hand is, what's the baseline? What's the alternative? So it's the same like in renewable energy, also solar PV or a wind power plant or whatever, any other power plant has its impacts. The question is not that you won't use that electricity. You want that amount of electricity. How can you produce it otherwise? And in a car, it's the same. So if the baseline is a petrol or a diesel car, and if you look at the life cycle impact of a petrol or a diesel car, an electric car will have different impacts, but will have, if you make a cumulative life cycle impact on all the different parts, it will have a much lower impact. If you just look at the greenhouse gas component, one example, 5 years ago, 1 kilowatt hour of car battery had an average 200 kilogram of CO2 embedded. Now it's around 100 kilogram, and it's expected that this goes to 50 kilogram in less than 3 years. At the same time, the electric vehicles are more efficient, the energy density is higher, so you can drive a longer range with the same kilowatt hour of battery. So this shows clearly that in the greenhouse gas component, you can calculate it backwards and forwards, life cycle ways, you can make different assumptions, but your fossil car will always be worse. You also have to look at not just the petrol combusted, but also the upstream and downstream emissions of fossil fuels, extraction, refinery, transport, etc. So yes, you do have an environmental impact. Yes, you should do more about that. And I think there are in these electric vehicle projects, which ADB is, for example, supporting, you have technical assistance, for example, to make battery regulations that include extended producer responsibilities, which thereafter incorporates also digital logging of the batteries to know where they are, how to reuse or repurpose, recycle, or dispose of appropriately in the batteries, how to put up systems which ensure that you have the financial capacities, even if vendors go broke in the meantime, to ensure that these batteries are still taken care of as long as it's financially not viable commercially. So I think you can work on these parts to improve the environmental impact, to reduce the footprint you're having of your ventures, but it is clear that you do have an impact there on cars, and it's also one of the issues why you won't resolve all the environmental problems by just replacing your passenger car of a fossil nature with an electric 2-ton truck. That won't resolve all the problems. You'll still have the problem that you're using a lot of space for these cars, that you're using a lot of roads, that you have lots of accidents. And you get rolled over by a Tesla just the same way as you get rolled over by a fossil Toyota. I mean, you die just the same way, probably even worse with a Tesla pickup truck. So, I mean, you don't resolve these problems by electrifying. So you still have other issues which you have to work on independent of the technology.
Sorry, I'm just thinking I don't want to be rolled over by any cars at all. So, I mean, if I have a choice, you know, just no rolling over by cars. Anyway, so I want to see if there's any questions from the floor, and then there's microphone. And please come up. We have 3 microphones on the floor. And then I ask, please keep your question brief. And then, because we have a few minutes left for the sessions, please go ahead. And there's a microphone there, and please go ahead. Yeah.
It's more of a query into where we're going in terms of ADB supporting low carbon urban mobility. I saw that in your slide, Mr. Grutter, because if as Asian cities grow, become more urbanized, become more compact, like in the Philippines, we still have to walk in the street. And that actually makes a lot of people use their cars. I know people from ADB, they don't want to use their cars. So what they do is they get a condominium in Makati or in Magallanes where there are direct links with the MRT, so they can now move directly. But if they lived in Ortigas, it's actually easier to go by car. So I wonder if ADB will make investments or think of investments that will encourage low carbon urban mobility, such as paying for walkways, bridgeways, and similar infrastructure.
Thank you. So let's hear more questions before we go back to our panelists. There's a microphone there. Please go to the microphone.
Okay.
Let's go. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, good morning, everyone. I'm Angie Mata from the National Confederation of Transport Workers Union. This question goes for all the panelists. How can ADB assist the transport cooperatives to continue the process on just transition to EV-based as a public transport and the inclusion of more women in the male-dominated sector? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Good morning. I'm Nick Aquino from the private sector. I have a question about policy formulation. My question is, does ADB supports evidence-based policies? What specific tools are being used for policy development regarding impact evaluations? And what are your thoughts about RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and quasi-experimental designs? Thank you.
So basically, okay, we have Shurat.
One last, thanks, Susan. So it was a fascinating discussion. My question is basically on monitoring our climate financing. And as you know, as we've kind of transitioned to lower carbon transport systems, initially a simplified methodology was adopted in which 100% of the financing for that, say, an urban rail system was allocated and counted towards climate finance. As we have evolved, are we thinking of raising our level of ambition? Because clearly one urban rail system may be different from another in terms of reduction of carbon emissions. A particular system may use regenerative braking, for instance, which will reduce the level of emissions, whereas the other won't. So is there some thinking on how do we differentiate between our low carbon transport systems when counting our carbon finance?
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent questions. Maybe let's focus on the discussions. I thought from the floor this morning, the questions about gender, I think that wasn't discussed this morning. Maybe I think it's something interesting to bring in. And then the second question is related to transport, right? The low carbon monitoring. How are we going to adjust to differentiate different kind of transport in terms of the impact? And then that maybe the first questions would be maybe Toru about the gender part, and then I will ask Kate about the questions about the questions from Sharad, and then the questions about urban transport, low carbon mobility. Maybe instead of Jurg, maybe we can hear from Priyantha from the energy perspective and see, because we're talking about disruptions, so we want to hear from other panelists, right? What is their view about urban transport? So please, Toru.
I'll just maybe quickly touch on a few things that were raised. So on gender, Susan, we're really working a lot on this. Pin also touched on this in our projects, but a couple of initiatives. So we have the gender and heat, that is a flagship, and the heat impact on the people. And unfortunately, climate change impacts are not gender neutral. Everyone is impacted, but there are vulnerable groups that are more impacted, and especially unique impacts on women due to various characteristics. So this is an area of focus. It's relatively new. We had a fantastic convening of experts in this area in our annual meeting in Tbilisi just a few weeks ago. And we're collaborating with many partners to bring this and make sure that our designs for policy and projects that we support our developing member countries address these differences, the different impacts on gender. We have the Community Resilience Partnership Program that is really focused on the nexus of climate change, but also poverty and gender. So how can we have local knowledge-based solutions involving women in coming up with the best adaptation solutions that address their real needs and challenges. So, I mean, I can raise so many other examples, but we're out of time, so let me stop there. Just one of the questions on non-motorized transport, that is an area that ADB has been working on. One of our colleagues focusing on the Philippines was involved in the Ortigas, the green transport, which was really working on the elevated walkways to make it more safe. And in our designs for roads and urban planning, we are trying to help the cities becoming more walkable and bikeable. So that's definitely, and I'm sure my colleagues can elaborate on that. I think Kate is the best person to talk about the just transition aspects, which is going from the current sort of status quo on transport to the future decarbonized resilient transport, and how do we make sure that we are really looking at the labor impacts and other indirect impacts to make sure that it's a whole of society approach. And everyone can be involved and supported in this. But also on the climate financing, Sharad, because we're working with MDBs. It's an MDB joint principle on climate financing and methodology that we apply. So we can't change it alone. But more importantly, we're moving decisively from counting the input on money to the outcomes, which is the point that Kate made earlier. That's the most important. So how do we differentiate the interventions based on everything we support is development, right? But what are the contributions to climate adaptation and mitigation outcomes? And we take a differentiated approach. So we are developing a project categorization system, and depending on the merit, they may be able to access some incentives, such as streamlined modalities, priority access to concessional resources, and other ideas. Over to other colleagues.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I know we're running short on time, so I'll try and keep the answers short, but very happy to have a further discussion. So firstly, on the just transition. So this is one of ADB's key agendas that we're working on, and like a lot of people or institutions, it started in the energy sector, but we do have a very firm focus on the transport sector. We have a Just Transition support platform, and we're designing a Just Transition finance facility. And that Just Transition support platform is supporting the Philippines. So we're currently working with DNR, DOTR, DOE, many departments looking at organising a multi-stakeholder forum to kind of initiate the discussion on the policy and institutional environment for Just Transition. I think key on that is that we need to understand, as I said, that this is about transitioning economies and societies, and so the socioeconomic impacts need to be identified and managed. But what is key is that this isn't a layer on top of a project financing solution. And so we need to de-link the timing of the finance that goes for the socioeconomic from the finance that goes with the project. Because if we look at labour impacts, we look at managing Just Transition, some of that support may need to come in well ahead of the investments in decarbonisation. So that's a core part of the way that we're approaching it, and very happy to have a further discussion with you. Just quickly on the climate finance to add to what Toru said. So I think continuing on this same theme that we're looking at systems transformation, right? So on the mitigation side, which I focus on, looking at the impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction is obviously the key indicator and outcome indicator. One of the challenging areas that we are working on in terms of these categorization and differentiated approaches is how you effectively capture the value of transition investments. So those investments or those activities that may not directly result in the greenhouse gas emissions but are essential to open up those pathways for further investments. And so that's really a challenging area, I think, to try and that's in energy, in transport, in many sectors, to try and capture the value and the necessity of those investments if they don't directly result. So that's one of the areas that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment. Thanks.
Yeah, as for the urban transport systems, probably more than me, I'm sure Jurg is more qualified to answer the questions. But from the energy sector viewpoint, I think what we would like to see is shifting the transport systems to more mass transport systems rather than private transport systems. Of course, based on electrification of mass transport systems. And also, again, strengthening e-charging and e-charging infrastructure in urban areas. Those are more important things as far as transport is concerned. But to add to that, I'll request Jurg to come in.
Yeah, just this point in urban transport system, what you mentioned on walking, that is an important component of urban transport projects today designed by ADB. Just to give you a recent example of a project approved in Kyrgyzstan for Bishkek, which includes not only electric buses and bus separated lanes, but it also includes improved pedestrian walkways to get to the connectivity. It includes cycling lanes to have also more non-motorized transport. So it's really an approach which also caters to trying to get more density in the urban areas and to moving people towards these short distance transport means which are more favorable than any car or bus by walking or by cycling. So it's really an integrated approach which is tried to be followed.
Thank you. So before we wrap up the session, maybe we can ask the panelists to come in for a 1-minute takeaway message to our audience this morning. Let's start with Pin.
So from the private sector side, whatever our private sector clients need, we are here to support in any way we can. If you'd like us to help mobilize financing package, we're happy to be the mandated lead arranger working with our syndications team to talk to other co-lenders. If you need market studies, feasibility studies, we will work with our regional department, transport sector group, and our climate change and sustainable development department to deploy our technical assistant. So basically, if you need any kind of support, we will work together to provide a comprehensive one ADB solutions to the client to address your financing needs to support clean transition on sustainable transport. Thank you.
I think the core point is that the technologies and methods today are to a large extent available. It's a question of shifting towards these and getting away from the traditional way of doing business, although the traditional way is not only environmentally harmful, but also financially often far less attractive than the new technologies. And that's where ADB can make a decisive role by focusing their finance on these new technologies and methodologies.
Yes, as you know, transport sector is in fact, if not the biggest, one of the biggest contributors to GHG emissions in most of our DMCs. In fact, major consumer of primary energy. Therefore, energy and transport will have to work much more closely than what we are doing now within ADB itself. That's my feeling. To bring in the latest technologies, overall impact will be much more. Yeah.
Thank you. I think a key message is, solving climate change is not about individual discrete climate investments. It's really about ADB working together with our clients to try to jointly solve complex, multidimensional development challenges, right? And so if we approach it in that way, then we can look at how we can get synergies between sectors, how we can mobilize upstream, midstream, downstream support, how we can use different instruments and look really jointly at how we solve the problem rather than individual project by project solutions. Thanks.
Well, my takeaway is I might be the only electric vehicle owner in the room. But am I proud about it? No. I would rather walk to work. And before joining ADB, and yes, I was going to say Kate is a runner. And before joining Manila, ADB in Manila, I used to cycle to work every day. So can we do that? You can actually use your bicycle. Many people use it here, but it can be quite dangerous. So how can we work towards more multimodal integrated systems that are safe, clean, healthy, and low carbon resilient for our countries? But just one thing, so maybe a takeaway message for this audience is from ADB's perspective. We really want to provide larger volumes of finance, but also knowledge, convening sort of responsibility, such as this, and bringing all the experts and decision makers together. And we want to provide the finance at lower cost if there's a larger contribution to global regional public goods, such as climate change. And we want to do it faster. We're not fast enough. We want to respond quicker in delivery of development results. And we want to use that in a way to unlock, so address market barriers, unlock private investment coming in. And we are working on these, the Climate Change Action Plan for these incentives and improving our services. So again, if you have specific ideas, please come talk to us. We would really appreciate it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for being such an excellent audience this morning. And also thank you so much for our panelists this morning and share with us your knowledge and experience in the topic. So we're going to wrap up the sessions. And I know my takeaway is I need to read the Climate Action Plan again and then provide comments and feedbacks. So I really appreciate everyone being here this morning. Thank you.